Nothing announces itself when you stop explaining yourself. There's no argument, no confrontation, no visible turning point. What happens instead is quieter and more permanent. The air changes, conversations shorten, people respond differently without knowing why. Not because you became colder, but because you removed effort. When explanations disappear, interpretation begins. And interpretation exposes truth. Silence doesn't create power. It reveals where it already existed. You don't gain leverage by saying more. You gain it by refusing to negotiate your position. This isn't a strategy. It's a pattern. Men who stop explaining don't become distant. They become grounded. And once that shift happens, everything around them recalibrates on its own. Number 1, people stop arguing with you. After you stop explaining yourself, arguments don't escalate, they dissolve. Not instantly, but consistently. Pushback loses energy, questions shorten, challenges soften. Explanations give people something to push against. Silence doesn't. When you stop justifying decisions, there's nothing left to debate. Others are forced to either accept your position or disengage from it. Most choose acceptance, not because they agree, but because resistance no longer produces leverage. Arguments require emotional participation. Silence removes that fuel. You're no longer clarifying, correcting, or defending. And without defense, conflict has nowhere to land. Conversations end sooner. Tension fades faster. You didn't overpower anyone. You simply stopped feeding the exchange. That's why it collapses. The absence of explanation removes openings. There's no angle to exploit, no weakness to press on, no reassurance to extract. What remains is stillness. And stillness makes argument unnecessary. You didn't win the argument. You made it unproductive. And once arguments stop producing results, they stop appearing altogether. Number 2, people start watching you more closely. When you stop explaining yourself, attention shifts without announcement. People listen less to your words and more to your behavior. Observation replaces assumption. They start noticing timing, consistency, and restraint. Not because you changed, but because you stopped narrating yourself. Explanations make people comfortable. Silence makes them alert. Without verbal guidance, others are forced to interpret. And interpretation demands focus. They begin watching how you respond or don't. They notice what moves you and what doesn't. Small pauses matter more. Reactions carry weight. People test less directly and more subtly. Pressure becomes quieter. Questions become fewer. Silence doesn't confuse the room. It recalibrates it. You're no longer managing perception or correcting misunderstandings. You're letting behavior speak uninterrupted. That uninterrupted signal feels heavier than explanation ever did. People adjust instinctively. They choose their words more carefully. They slow down. They observe before acting. You didn't become mysterious by design. You removed unnecessary access. And that absence made your presence harder to ignore. Number 3, low-respect connections fade out. After you stop explaining yourself, certain people begin to disappear. Not loudly, not angrily, quietly. Messages slow. Invitations stop. Conversations lose momentum. This isn't conflict, it's exposure. Explanations once kept these connections alive. They provided access, reassurance, and emotional labor without requiring respect. Silence removes that support. When you stop justifying yourself, people who relied on your overextension no longer know how to engage. There's nothing to argue with, nothing to extract, nothing to lean on. So they disengage. Not because you push them away, but because the dynamic no longer benefits them. This isn't rejection, it's filtration. Silence reveals who valued you versus who valued access to you. The shift happens without confrontation because it doesn't need one. Weak connections dissolve when effort is removed. What remains are fewer interactions but cleaner ones, more deliberate, less draining. You didn't choose who stayed, silence did. And once the noise clears, the difference becomes impossible to ignore. Number 4. Respect shows up without discussion. After you stop explaining yourself, respect doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives quietly, in behavior. People interrupt less. They pause before responding. They choose their words more carefully. Not because you asked them to, but because the dynamic changed. When explanations disappear, boundaries stop feeling negotiable. There's no opening to push through, no angle to debate. Silence communicates finality, and finality forces adjustment. This isn't admiration. It isn't approval. It's structural respect, the kind that exists without validation. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't assert dominance. You simply stopped justifying your position. And positions that don't need defense feel solid. People sense when something isn't movable. They adapt around it. That adaptation is respect, not emotional respect, but practical respect. The kind that shows up in how others approach you, not what they say about you. Silence removes the illusion that everything is open for discussion. Once that illusion is gone, interactions stabilize. Authority doesn't need explanation. It needs consistency. And silence is the clearest signal of both. Number 5. You feel internally still for the first time. The most significant change after you stop explaining yourself happens internally. The noise quiets. The mental replay ends. Conversations stop following you home. You no longer rehearse responses in your head or revisit moments where you think you should have said more. Explanations keep the mind active and outward-facing. Silence pulls everything back into place. Decisions become cleaner. Reactions slow down. You stop anticipating objections that never come. You stop preparing defenses you no longer need. There's less urgency in your thoughts, less tension in your body. You're no longer managing perception. You're no longer monitoring reactions. You simply move forward. That internal stillness becomes visible. People sense it before they can name it. Calm doesn't announce itself. It doesn't persuade or posture. It just exists. And existence without friction feels solid. Once you experience that level of internal control, explaining feels unnecessary, almost disruptive. Agreement becomes optional. Validation becomes irrelevant. You're no longer steady because others respond well. You're steady because nothing is pulling you off center. And that internal stability quietly reshapes every interaction around you. What happens after you stop explaining yourself isn't chaos. It's order. The wrong dynamics dissolve. The right ones remain. Respect replaces negotiation. Silence replaces friction. You don't become distant. You become clear. Most men never experience this shift because they mistake explanation for strength. It isn't. Strength is standing still without justification. When words stop carrying the load, presence takes over. Presence doesn't argue. It doesn't chase understanding. It allows others to respond honestly or not at all. That's where control returns. Not because you demanded it, because you stopped giving it away.